Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are exploring the mechanics of securing the internet's front door.
The front door. Exactly.
Yeah, so if you are prepping to lock down a massive web infrastructure, or, if you just want to understand the invisible architecture keeping web applications secure behind the scenes,
You are definitely in the right place.
you really are. Our roadmap for this analysis is this highly detailed March 2026 Medium article.
Published by SOCFortress.
Right. It's titled NGINX Secure Deployment and Hardening Guide, CIS Benchmarks. And our mission here is to basically take this super technical, infrastructure-focused hardening reference and translate it.
Translated into a clear strategic map of digital defense.
Exactly. We're going to unpack the architecture of secure web applications and give you those critical aha moments, but without the massive information overload.
Because, the value of a benchmark guide like this isn't in just memorizing a static list of technical settings.
No, not at all.
The real power comes from understanding the underlying philosophy. When you grasp the operational logic, exactly, the why behind these specific configurations, then the massive list of what suddenly forms a cohesive strategy.
So let's establish the battlefield here. NGINX is, it's arguably the workhorse of the modern internet.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a web server, a reverse proxy, a load balancer.
An HTTP cache.
Right. And because it handles thousands of concurrent connections with incredibly low memory usage, it is deployed everywhere.
Everywhere.
But its ubiquity and its role as that front-facing shield for encrypted communications, that means it sits directly at the edge of the environment.
Which is really the most precarious place to be.
Yeah.
Because NGINX sits at that edge, handling static content and distributing incoming traffic to your internal backend servers. It represents your primary attack surface.
It's the shield taking the hits.
Right. It is the very first piece of infrastructure a bad actor interacts with when they start probing a network.
The perimeter takes the first wave of fire, and the real-world consequences of, just leaving the default settings in place or misconfiguring that perimeter, they're severe.
Devastating, really.
The SOCFortress guide outlines that these oversights regularly lead to massive data exposure.
Authentication bypasses.
Right. And TLS downgrade attacks.
Where malicious actors basically force the server to fall back on older, breakable encryption.
Which is terrifying. Ultimately, a weak perimeter leads to full host compromise via web exploitation.
Because if the front door is compromised, the internal network architecture behind it is just completely exposed.
Wide open.
That is why security cannot be an afterthought. It has to begin at the very moment of installation.
The guide is actually really adamant about that. You can't simply run an automated install script and walk away.
No, you have to manually ensure the package manager repositories.
The sources your server pulls its software from.
Exactly. You have to ensure they are strictly vetted and configured.
Which limits the blast radius. If you aren't rigorously managing your software supply chain and ensuring the absolute latest software packages are installed, you are basically deploying known vulnerabilities directly to the public internet.
And nobody wants to do that.
Definitely not. Okay, let's unpack this because we are moving into account security.
Section 2 of the guide.
Right. And the strategy here is fundamentally about least privilege. NGINX must run using a non-privileged dedicated service account.
Yes.
But the CIS benchmarks mandate this really fascinating restriction. This service account must be locked, and it must have an invalid shell.
Oh, I love this part. This is a brilliant example of setting a trapdoor in your own infrastructure.
How so?
Well, we know that if a highly sophisticated attacker compromises the NGINX service account, their immediate next step is to open a shell.
Right. They want the command line.
Exactly. They want that command line interface to start downloading malware, executing system-level commands, pivoting laterally into other parts of the network.
So you're essentially setting up a scenario where even if they steal the key and open the door,
there's no floor underneath them.
I love that visual.
It's the perfect way to visualize it. When you configure an invalid shell for that specific service account, the operating system effectively neuters the account's interactive capabilities.
But the account is still running.
Yes, the account remains active in the background, which is necessary for the NGINX web server process to actually run and serve the web pages.
Right.
But the moment someone tries to use that account to open a command line interface, the operating system just denies the request.
It shuts it down.
The attacker is stopped entirely because the interface they need to escalate their attack simply refuses to load.
Building on that concept of denying resources, the guide insists on aggressively minimizing the overall attack surface.
Only the strictly required dynamic modules should be loaded into NGINX.
And the directory permissions are heavily restricted. I mean, NGINX directories and files must be owned by root.
Yep.
Even the process ID file, the PID file that tracks the core process of the web server itself, that has to be locked down to prevent tampering.
Because we have to acknowledge the reality of operational drift here.
Oh, definitely.
Implementing these least privileged controls during the initial deployment, that is only half the battle.
Right.
The guide emphasizes that these configurations must be continuously enforced. Network environments are super dynamic.
Somebody makes a change at 3 a.m.
Exactly. An administrator makes a temporary permission change to troubleshoot an issue at 3 in the morning and just forgets to revert it.
Which is why the guide points to automated enforcement tools. They specifically mention Wazoo SCA modules.
Security configuration assessment modules.
Right, or custom scripts.
Think of those SCA modules as a relentless digital building inspector.
I like that.
They're constantly comparing the actual state of your server's configuration against the pristine, secure blueprint you established on day one.
So if a permission changes,
The inspector immediately flags a violation, ensuring your server doesn't silently drift out of compliance over time.
okay, let's shift the focus to how NGINX handles the sheer volume of traffic hitting that front door.
And network configuration.
Right. The benchmarks dictate that NGINX must only listen for connections on authorized ports. And crucially, requests for unknown host names must be outright rejected.
This is your primary defense against automated, indiscriminate internet scanning.
Just the background radiation of the internet.
Basically, yeah. Botnets and automated scripts are constantly sweeping the internet, throwing generic requests at any IP address they find just to see what software responds.
So by configuring your server to instantly drop any request that doesn't explicitly ask for your specific authorized host name?
You effectively turn invisible to the vast majority of that background noise. You terminate the connection before the scanner can glean any useful information.
Which leads us directly into the mechanics of handling those actual connections.
What's fascinating here is the exact science of timeouts and how simply managing the clock becomes a robust security feature.
Right.
The benchmarks mandate that the keep alive timeout and send timeout directives must be set to 10 seconds or less.
10 seconds or less.
But the critical caveat is that they must never be set to 0.
Because in server configuration logic, setting a timeout to 0 frequently translates to an infinite timeout rather than 0 delay.
Exactly. And an infinite timeout is the core mechanism of a slow-rate denial-of-service attack.
A slow Loris attack.
Yes. A bad actor opens hundreds of connections to your server and then just holds them open, sending data at an agonizingly slow pace.
Just tripping it in.
Right. If your server has an infinite timeout, it patiently keeps those connections open, waiting for the request to finish.
And eventually, all of the server's available connection slots are occupied by these malicious, lingering requests. It's like a group of bad actors walking into a busy restaurant, sitting at every single table, ordering a single glass of water, and just refusing to leave.
And no legitimate customers can get a table.
The restaurant shuts down without a single piece of furniture being broken.
Precisely. By enforcing a strict 10-second limit on those connections, NGINX acts as a very aggressive manager, clearing out those lingering tables and freeing up memory and resources for legitimate user traffic.
Taking that concept of not cooperating with attackers even further, we arrive at information disclosure.
Playing hard to get.
Exactly. The objective here is to deny the attacker a map of your system. The CIS benchmarks are incredibly strict on this. The server tokens directive must be set to off.
I cannot stress this enough. I have been on incident response calls where the initial vector of compromise was entirely due to server tokens being left on.
Wow.
It is incredibly frustrating. When that directive is active, the server helpfully broadcasts the exact version of NGINX it is running right in the HTTP response headers.
So an attacker scans the server, reads the header, sees an outdated version number, and then just searches a database for the specific exploit tailored to that exact version.
Right. You are essentially handing them the blueprints to the vault.
But by turning server tokens off, the server still functions perfectly.
It just only identifies itself generically. You force the attacker to guess what vulnerabilities might be present, which significantly slows them down.
The guide actually extends this obscurity across the board. Default error pages and the default index HTML page must be stripped of any NGINX branding or references.
Hidden file serving must be disabled.
Right. And the reverse proxy itself must be configured to prevent any internal information from leaking out in the headers. It is about presenting a completely opaque black box to the public internet.
Security by obscurity is never a complete defense strategy on its own, obviously.
Sure.
But systematically denying reconnaissance data to an adversary is a mandatory layer of defense in depth.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The transition from physical server hardening to the encryption layer, Section 4.
In CIS.
Right. The absolute baseline here is redirecting all HTTP traffic to HTTPS and ensuring a trusted certificate and trust chain are installed.
And treating the private keys for those certificates with the utmost paranoia.
The benchmark lists restricting private key permissions as a high-severity control.
Because if an adversary extracts your private key, your entire encryption posture just collapses. They can decrypt intercepted traffic or perfectly impersonate your server to users.
The guide also pushes heavily for modernizing cryptography. The directive is to use only modern TLS protocols and to completely disable weak ciphers.
Yes.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second. If administrators disable older, weaker ciphers, don't they risk locking out users who are trying to access the site from legacy devices or older web browsers? How do you balance that security with accessibility?
It is the classic tension in systems administration.
Yeah.
But the CIS benchmarks and modern security standards in general, they draw a hard line here.
No exceptions.
Computing power is advancing too rapidly. Cryptographic ciphers that were considered unbreakable 10 years ago can now be cracked relatively quickly by well-resourced attackers.
So the risk is just too high.
Exactly.
Oh.
If you configure NGINX to negotiate a weak cipher just to accommodate a handful of ancient browsers, you are downgrading the security of your entire application and putting all user data at risk.
Wow.
You have to enforce modern cryptographic standards and accept that legacy compatibility is a security liability.
And the guide dives into highly advanced TLS features to reinforce that modern standard. Like, it requires awareness of TLS 1.3 new Diffie-Hellman parameters.
Right.
For anyone unfamiliar, we can think of Diffie-Hellman like two people securely mixing paint colors in public.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks. They exchange public colors, mix in their own secret colors, and arrive at the exact same final shade. Even if an attacker watches the entire exchange, they can't reverse engineer the final color because they don't have the secret ingredients.
It ensures secure key exchange and perfect forward secrecy.
And that forward secrecy is paramount.
It really is. Even if a private key is compromised in the future, past communications remain encrypted. The guide also mandates enabling online certificate status protocol stapling.
OCSP stapling.
Yes.
So instead of a user's browser having to contact the certificate authority every single time to check if a site's security certificate has been revoked.
Which slows down the connection and compromises privacy.
Right. OCSP stapling allows NGINX to periodically get a digitally signed timestamp from the authority. It's like a bouncer holding a freshly signed, pre-approved VIP list, rather than having to call the main office every time someone walks up to the door.
It drastically improves connection speeds while maintaining strict validation.
Awesome.
The guide also requires enabling HTTP Strict Transport Security, or HSTS.
What does that do?
This is a mechanism where the server explicitly instructs the user's browser to never, under any circumstances, attempt to connect over unencrypted HTTP in the future.
Even if the user manually types it into the address bar.
Exactly. It locks the encryption requirement down on the client side.
But what happens behind NGINX? We've built this massive armored front door. But as a reverse proxy, NGINX ultimately has to open a back door to hand the traffic off to the internal application servers. How does it secure that handover?
Well, that internal connection cannot be treated with implicit trust just because it's behind the firewall. The benchmarks state that upstream server traffic must be authenticated with a client certificate. NGINX requires cryptographic proof from the back-end server before it hands over the data.
And the upstream traffic server certificate must be verified and trusted by NGINX.
Yes, so you're extending that encrypted tunnel all the way from the user's laptop through the NGINX proxy directly into the internal application logic.
And for optimal performance, secure session resumption is enabled for those internal handshakes.
And the guide also points toward the future by recommending HTTP 3.0 to keep the transport layer as modern and efficient as possible.
Which brings us to the operational phase, request filtering and browser security. Building the encrypted tunnel is useless if you allow malicious payloads to travel through it.
Exactly. Request filtering sets strict boundaries on every interaction.
The guide requires allow and deny filters to limit access to sensitive areas by specific IP address. It also demands that only approved HTTP methods are allowed.
Right. If a public-facing API only needs to provide data, you configure NGINX to only accept GET-D requests.
Immediately blocking any attempt to put or delete data.
We also see the return of strict resource limits to prevent server exhaustion and buffer overflows.
The benchmarks mandate defining the maximum buffer size for URIs, the web addresses themselves.
Because a buffer overflow in this context is essentially an attacker sending an absurdly long web address, hoping the server allocates a specific amount of memory for it.
And when the address exceeds that memory, the data spills over into adjacent memory spaces,
Potentially corrupting the system or allowing code execution. It is like pouring a gallon of water into a pint glass.
The overflow ruins whatever is sitting on the table next to it.
Exactly. By strictly defining the URI buffer size and setting limits on the maximum request body size, NGINX simply rejects the oversized payload before it can cause memory corruption.
The server also needs strict rate limiting by IP address, limiting the total number of connections a single IP can make.
That is your primary defense against brute force login attempts or credential stuffing.
If an automated script tries to test 500 stolen passwords against your login portal in 2 seconds,
The rate limit kicks in, and NGINX drops the connections.
moving to the user side, the guide details browser security headers. And this isn't just about sending data. This is about NGINX actively deputizing the user's web browser to act as a secondary layer of defense.
The server uses these headers to provide the browser with a strict set of behavioral rules for interacting with the application.
Like the Content Security Policy, the CSP.
A prime example. Cross-site scripting attacks occur when a bad actor manages to inject malicious code into a legitimate website, and the user's browser unwittingly executes it.
But if NGINX sends a properly configured CSP header, it tells the browser exactly which domains are allowed to run scripts.
Right. If the malicious script comes from an unapproved source, the browser simply refuses to execute it, neutralizing the attack on the client side.
The guide also requires the X-Content Type Options header to prevent MIE sniffing vulnerabilities.
And a refer policy to ensure sensitive URLs aren't accidentally leaked to third-party websites when a user clicks an outbound link.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, all of these incredibly granular defenses,
The invalid shells, the timed-out connections, the encrypted upstream tunnels.
they mean very little if your security team has no visibility into the environment.
That brings us to logging, which is categorized as a high-severity control.
Detailed logging and access logging are non-negotiable. Error logging must be enabled and explicitly set to the info logging level.
Administrators need the informational breadcrumbs that lead up to a critical event, not just the crash report itself.
There is a critical proxy problem we have to address here, though. Because NGINX is a reverse proxy standing in front of the application servers, it is technically NGINX making the final connection to the backend.
Yes. If you do not explicitly configure NGINX to pass the original client source IP address forward, your backend application logs will be useless.
Because every single request in the backend logs will look like it originated from the NGINX server's own internal IP address.
Right.
It would be like a receptionist answering every single call for a company and then forwarding the calls to the executives without passing along the caller ID.
The executives would only ever see the receptionist's internal extension on their screen.
Having no idea who is actually on the line.
And that lack of visibility is a nightmare for incident response. If an attack breaches the application layer, the security team needs to know the true origin IP of the attacker to block them and investigate the scope of the campaign.
Passing that source IP information ensures the logs maintain their forensic integrity.
Exactly.
So, what does this all mean? We have navigated a deeply technical map of CIS benchmarks for NGINX. We've explored the necessity of limiting blast radiuses with proper package management, the elegance of trapping attackers with invalid shells,
The science of utilizing timeouts to prevent resource exhaustion.
and the critical importance of modern cryptography and perfect forward secrecy. For you, the listener, understanding this architecture reveals the immense, meticulous effort required to build the invisible armor that protects modern digital life.
It highlights that security is not a product you buy.
No, it is a relentless, continuous discipline of configuration and enforcement.
And that operational discipline requires visibility.
It certainly does. The platform behind this comprehensive guide, SOCFortress, actually specializes in providing that visibility.
They unify observability, security monitoring, threat intelligence, and security orchestration, automation, and response.
It gives infrastructure teams the cohesive tools required to actually manage and enforce the complex security postures we've discussed today.
This raises an important question, however, and it's something for you to consider long after we wrap up this analysis.
What's that?
We have detailed the extraordinary, exhaustive lengths administrators must go to in order to harden NGINX, precisely because it sits at the edge and takes the brunt of the Internet's hostility.
Right.
But if the front door requires this level of meticulous armor, how much more vulnerable are the internal, supposedly trusted back-end databases and application servers?
Are organizations falsely assuming their internal networks are safe simply because NGINX is standing guard at the perimeter?
Exactly.
That is a phenomenal, unsettling question to end on. The perimeter is strong, but the interior must be equally resilient. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of web security. Keep questioning the defaults, keep exploring the infrastructure around you, and we will see you next time.